It was an ordinary Monday morning in a small-town courtroom, the kind of place where routine cases were handled with mechanical precision. The gallery was filled with a mix of defendants, nervous college students clutching traffic tickets, middle-aged professionals scrolling through their phones, and a few weary faces who had clearly seen the inside of this room too many times. Presiding over it all was Judge Thomas Harris, a man whose reputation for strict discipline and unyielding authority preceded him. The gavel struck sharply against the wooden block, cutting through the low murmur of the room like a whip. Judge Harris leaned forward, adjusting his glasses, ready to call the next case. His courtroom was his domain, and he ruled it with an iron fist. Then it happened. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open, interrupting the proceedings. Heads turned as a tall, poised black woman entered, her stride brisk, yet calm. She glanced at the clock, her expression betraying just a hint of unease. Judge Harris immediately paused, his gaze locking onto her like a hawk spotting prey, his brow furrowed in visible irritation. Late arrivals in his courtroom were not just frowned upon, they were seen as direct challenges to his authority. The room seemed to hold its collective breath. The judge's gavel tapped again, this time slower, more deliberate. "Step forward," he commanded, his voice cold and sharp. The woman obeyed, walking to the podium with a calm professionalism that didn't match the growing tension in the air. The judge's eyes narrowed as he shuffled the papers in front of him. No one in the room could have guessed who she was, or how this seemingly routine case would soon unravel years of hidden bias and bring this courtroom to the center of a national reckoning. Dr. Maya Brooks was the kind of person who commanded attention without needing to ask for it. At 39 years old, she had carved a path that few dared to dream of. A Harvard Law School graduate and one of the youngest tenured professors at Jefferson Law School, she was widely respected, not only for her sharp legal mind, but also for her unwavering dedication to justice. Maya specialized in judicial ethics and systemic reform, fields that demanded not just intellect, courage, a quality she had in abundance. Despite her accolades, Maya remained grounded. She preferred substance over flash, and while her professional wardrobe was impeccable, she often joked that her real superpower was thriving on 2 cups of coffee and a meticulously planned schedule. Her students adored her, not just because she made the complexities of law seem accessible, but because she genuinely cared. "The law is only as good as the people who enforce it," she would tell them, her voice steady but impassioned. "If we don't fight for fairness, who will?" Her mornings typically began in the quiet comfort of her home office. Bookshelves lined with well-worn legal volumes stood as a testament to her lifelong love of learning. On this particular morning, sunlight streamed through the large windows, casting a warm glow over her workspace. Maya sat at her desk, a half-empty coffee mug beside her, reviewing notes for her upcoming lecture. It was a routine she found grounding, familiar, and predictable in a world often filled with chaos. But that morning wasn't entirely ordinary. As she glanced at the clock, she felt a slight pang of annoyance. A minor dispute over a parking ticket had thrown a wrench in her otherwise seamless schedule. Normally, she might have brushed off such an inconvenience, but the ticket had been issued in error, and Maya was determined to see it corrected. It wasn't about the money. It was about something else. Still, she planned her day with precision, calculating how to squeeze in the municipal court appearance between her lecture and a few student meetings. Meanwhile, across town, the courthouse was waking up to its own rhythm. The municipal court was a stark contrast to Maya's orderly home. It was a hive of activity, buzzing with energy but tinged with tension. Defendants shuffled nervously in their seats, flipping through paperwork or whispering anxiously to family members. Clerks typed away at their desks, their keyboards clicking in a near-constant rhythm. Security guards scanned the room, their expressions neutral, but their presence unmistakable. Judge Thomas Harris presided over this world. His courtroom was a reflection of his personality, rigid, efficient, and deeply hierarchical. Polished wooden benches gleamed under fluorescent lights, and a large seal of justice hung prominently behind the bench, as if to remind everyone of the gravity of their surroundings. Harris himself was a man who took pride in maintaining order. To him, every minute mattered, and tardiness was an unforgivable sin. He had a reputation for being firm but fair, or so he believed. By the time Maya pulled into the courthouse parking lot, she was running 10 minutes behind schedule. A small frown crossed her face as she hurriedly gathered her belongings. The parking lot was nearly full, forcing her to walk briskly toward the courthouse entrance. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of freshly cut grass and exhaust fumes. She adjusted her blazer and took a deep breath before stepping inside. The courthouse doors opened into a bustling atrium. Rows of wooden benches lined the walls, filled with people waiting for their cases to be called. A woman in her 20s clutched a stack of papers to her chest, nervously chewing on her lip. An older man in a faded suit sat hunched over, muttering to himself as he flipped through a legal pad. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation and unease, the kind that only a room full of people awaiting judgment can create. Maya paused for a moment, surveying the scene. Her law professor instincts kicked in, analyzing the dynamics at play. To her left, a clerk called out a name, prompting a middle-aged man to approach the bench. To her right, a young couple whispered heatedly, their words lost in the ambient noises of shuffling papers and hushed voices. She knew this environment well, not as a defendant, but as someone who had spent years studying and teaching the nuances of legal systems. Today, however, she wasn't here as an academic observer. Today, she was just another face in the crowd, another case on the docket. And yet, something about the way Judge Harris presided over his courtroom caught her attention. His sharp, deliberate mannerisms suggested a man who valued control above all else. As she walked toward the courtroom, the familiar weight of her briefcase in hand, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that this day would be different. What she didn't know was how profoundly that difference would shape not only her life, but the very systems she had spent her career studying and teaching. The courtroom was already in full swing by the time Maya Brooks entered. The sound of shuffling papers, muted whispers, and the occasional sharp crack of the gavel filled the air. She glanced at the clock hanging above the judge's bench and noted the time, 9:15 a.m., 15 minutes past the scheduled start for her case. Her mind raced as she crossed the threshold, hoping she could explain the delay without too much fuss. As she stepped in, her presence drew immediate attention. The room seemed to momentarily pause, all eyes turning toward the poised black woman who had just entered. The clerk, a young woman with a harried expression, looked up from her paperwork and quickly gestured for Maya to step forward. Judge Thomas Harris, seated high above the room, stopped mid-sentence during another case and fixed Maya with a piercing glare. "Step forward," Harris barked, his voice cold and sharp. Maya straightened her shoulders, maintaining her composure. She approached the podium with steady steps, her neatly tailored blazer and professional demeanor contrasting starkly with the tension radiating from the judge's bench. "You're late," Judge Harris said, his tone clipped. "Court starts at 9. Punctuality is not optional in this courtroom." "I apologize, Your Honor," Maya replied calmly, meeting his gaze. "I had an issue with my car this morning and got delayed finding parking. It won't happen again." Her voice was steady, professional, and devoid of excuses. But Harris's expression hardened. "Excuses," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for the courtroom to hear. "You're wasting this court's time. For that, I'm imposing a $250 fine for contempt." A murmur rippled through the room. Maya felt a brief pang of disbelief. A fine? For arriving 10 minutes late? She had seen late arrivals handled with a warning, even a slight nod of understanding. This was different. Maya inhaled deeply, regaining her focus. "Your Honor," she said, her voice measured, "I understand the importance of respecting the court's time. However, I believe the circumstances surrounding my case are relevant here." Judge Harris leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Circumstances? Let me guess. Another parking ticket you think doesn't apply to you?" Maya blinked, caught off guard by the dismissive tone. "Actually, Your Honor, the parking ticket was issued in error. I have photographic evidence to prove that the signage in the area was contradictory." She reached into her briefcase, and retrieved a folder, offering it to the clerk for submission. Harris waved a hand dismissively. "We'll get to that when we get to it. For now, we're addressing your tardiness." His gaze bore into her, as if daring her to challenge him further. Maya felt the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders. This wasn't just about the parking ticket anymore. The judge's tone, his words, the way he seemed to be scrutinizing her as if she didn't belong, it was all too familiar. She had encountered this kind of bias before. Subtle, yet unmistakable, wrapped in the veneer of authority. The room grew quieter as the tension thickened. Maya glanced around and noticed the expressions of others in the gallery. A young white man who had arrived 5 minutes late earlier in the morning had received nothing more than a mild glance from the judge. A middle-aged woman who had stumbled over her paperwork had been met with a small understanding smile. But Maya, she was being held to a different standard, and it was evident to everyone. "Your Honor," Maya said, keeping her tone respectful yet firm, "with all due respect, I believe there's a disparity in how this situation is being addressed." Harris's eyes narrowed. "Are you questioning my judgment in my courtroom?" "I'm asking for fairness, Your Honor," Maya replied, standing her ground. The tension was palpable now, the kind that made even seasoned court clerks pause in their typing. Harris leaned forward, his voice dropping to a cold, almost menacing tone. "Miss Brooks, I suggest you tread carefully. This is not a lecture hall where you can debate procedure. This is my courtroom, and you will respect it." The words stung, but Maya didn't flinch. She could feel the heat of everyone's gaze on her. Somewhere in the back of the room, a middle-aged black man shook his head slightly, as if he'd seen this scene play out too many times before. "I do respect the court, Your Honor," Maya said, her voice unwavering. "But respect should go both ways." Harris's face flushed slightly, but he quickly masked it with an air of indignation. He picked up his gavel, as if emphasizing his authority would end the discussion. "The fine stands. We'll hear your case on the ticket, provided there are no further disruptions." Maya took her seat, her mind racing. This was no longer just about a parking ticket or even the fine. It was about something far larger, a pattern she had studied, taught about, and now was experiencing firsthand. As she sat, she couldn't help but replay the morning's events. The dismissiveness, the assumptions, the double standards. It was a textbook example of implicit bias in the justice system. She glanced at the others in the gallery, noticing their quiet nods and exchanged glances. She wasn't the only one who saw it. The clerk called her name again, signaling that her case was now being addressed. Maya stood, walking to the podium with a sense of purpose. This time, she wasn't just a defendant. She was a woman determined to hold the system accountable. As she approached, she noticed Judge Harris's demeanor shift slightly. Perhaps he sensed the shift in the room's energy, the way people now watched him more intently, scrutinizing his every word and gesture. "Your case involves a disputed parking ticket, correct?" Harris said, his tone more clipped than before. "Yes, Your Honor," Maya replied, presenting her evidence once again. "The signage in the area was contradictory, and I have photographs to substantiate my claim." Harris flipped through the documents with a practiced disinterest. "I see. Well, the city will review this, but my initial ruling is to uphold the ticket. You may appeal if you wish." Maya's brow furrowed. "Your Honor, the evidence clearly shows—" "Enough," Harris interrupted, his gavel coming down hard. "The court's time is not here to debate every minor infraction." The room seemed to hold its collective breath again. Maya took a slow, deliberate step back, her hands clasped in front of her. Her mind was already cataloging every word, every action. This wasn't just about her now. It was about the people in the gallery, the countless individuals who had faced similar treatment, and the systemic flaws she had spent her career analyzing. What Judge Harris didn't realize was that this moment was no longer his to control. Maya Brooks had faced bias before, but this time she had the tools, the knowledge, and the resolve to do something about it. The tension in the room was thick, but for Maya, it was just the beginning. The fight for justice had only just begun. Maya stood tall at the podium, her composure unshaken, despite the palpable tension that filled the courtroom. Judge Harris leaned back in his chair, his gavel resting on the bench, as he observed her with a mixture of annoyance and skepticism. To him, she was just another defendant, someone who dared to question his authority in his courtroom. But Maya knew differently. She was no ordinary defendant, and this wasn't just another case. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady and clear, "I respectfully request that we revisit the evidence I presented. The photographs clearly show the contradictory parking signs in the area where the ticket was issued. I believe this is a matter of procedural fairness." Judge Harris waved dismissively, not even glancing at the documents. "Miss Brooks, I've already ruled. If you wish to appeal, you may do so through the proper channels." Maya's jaw tightened, but she maintained her calm. "Your Honor, with all due respect, I believe this court has an obligation to review all relevant evidence before making a determination. Dismissing it without consideration undermines the principles of justice this courtroom represents." Harris's eyes narrowed and his tone grew colder. "Are you questioning the court's ability to make a fair judgment? Because if so, I suggest you tread carefully. Contempt charges are not off the table." There it was again. That subtle, menacing tone meant to silence and intimidate. Maya had seen it before, and she knew exactly what it represented. This wasn't just about her case. It was about power, authority, and the systemic inequities that allowed individuals like Harris to wield both, without accountability. Taking a measured breath, Maya reached into her briefcase. The room watched intently, a heavy silence descending, as she pulled out a leather credential holder. The gold seal of Jefferson Law School caught the light as she held it up for all to see. "Your Honor," she said, her voice unwavering, "I am not merely a defendant standing before you. I am Dr. Maya Brooks, a tenured professor of law and ethics at Jefferson Law School. I specialize in judicial conduct and systemic reform. In fact, I believe you attended one of my lectures on implicit bias during your continuing legal education." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Harris's eyes widened, his expression briefly betraying his shock, before he quickly masked it with an air of indignation. He leaned forward, his hand gripping the edge of the bench as if to steady himself. "Dr. Brooks," he said slowly, his voice noticeably softer, "had I known your background, this situation would have been handled differently." Maya tilted her head slightly, her expression calm but resolute. "With respect, Your Honor, my background should not matter. Justice is supposed to be blind, is it not? The question isn't who I am, but why I was treated differently in the first place." The weight of her words hung in the air, resonating with everyone in the room. A young black man seated in the gallery nodded subtly, his expression one of quiet approval. An older woman, dressed in a faded cardigan, wiped a tear from her eye. Even the courtroom clerk, who had been typing furiously, paused her hands above the keyboard, as if to fully absorb the moment. Harris shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I assure you, Dr. Brooks, this court applies the law equally to all individuals. Does it, Your Honor?" Maya's question was pointed but devoid of malice. She placed her credentials on the podium and folded her hands in front of her. "This morning I observed several late arrivals in this courtroom. None of them faced fines or reprimands. One defendant, who happened to be white, received a mild warning despite arriving 20 minutes late. I, on the other hand, was fined $250 within minutes of stepping into this room. Does Your Honor have a question? I observed several late arrivals in this courtroom. Does Your Honor have any information about this? Can you explain that disparity?" The judge's face flushed, and he fumbled with his gavel. "Each case is unique. Circumstances vary." "Circumstances vary," Maya interrupted gently, "but the patterns do not. This is not about a single incident, Your Honor. This is about a broader issue, a systemic issue, one that perpetuates bias and erodes trust in our legal system." The gallery was utterly silent now, every person riveted by the exchange. Maya could feel their energy, a mix of outrage, admiration, and hope. She drew strength from it, knowing that this moment was about more than herself. "You are out of line, Dr. Brooks," Harris snapped, his voice rising. This court will not be used as a platform for your personal grievances. With respect, Your Honor, Maya replied, her tone unyielding. This is not about personal grievances. This is about accountability. This is about ensuring that the principles of fairness and justice are upheld, not just for me, but for everyone who steps into this courtroom. Harris opened his mouth to respond, but his words faltered. The courtroom clerk, sensing the gravity of the moment, resumed typing, her fingers moving with renewed urgency. The young man in the gallery who had nodded earlier now leaned forward, his gaze fixed on Maya with a look of quiet determination. Maya continued, her voice carrying the strength of her convictions. As a professor of law, I have dedicated my career to studying and teaching the principles that should guide our justice system. And as a woman of color, I have seen firsthand how often those principles are undermined by implicit bias and unchecked authority. Your Honor, this is not about me defying your authority. This is about ensuring that authority is exercised with integrity. The judge's gavel came down with a sharp crack, but the usual finality of the sound felt hollow. Enough, he said, though his voice lacked the conviction it had held earlier. The fine is rescinded. You may proceed with your case. Maya inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement, but she wasn't finished. Thank you, Your Honor, she said. But rescinding the fine doesn't address the underlying issue. I have documented the events of this morning, and I will be submitting a formal report to the Judicial Review Board, not to target you personally, but to highlight the patterns of behavior that undermine the very foundations of our legal system. Harris's face turned pale, and the room collectively inhaled. For a moment, no one moved. Then, as if on cue, a slow, deliberate clap came from the back of the gallery. It was the older woman in the cardigan, her face wet with tears, but her expression resolute. Others joined in, hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence. The courtroom was alive with the sound of quiet rebellion, a collective acknowledgement that something significant had just happened. Maya turned, her gaze sweeping across the room. She met the eyes of the young man, the older woman, and even the clerk, who gave her a small nod of solidarity. She had stood her ground, and in doing so, she had given voice to something larger than herself. As she left the podium and returned to her seat, she felt a surge of emotions: relief, pride, and determination. The fight wasn't over, but today she had taken a step forward, and judging by the expressions in the room, she wasn't alone in that journey. The courtroom remained silent, save for the faint clicking of the clerk's keyboard as she recorded the last moments of the session. Judge Harris sat rigid in his chair, his usual air of authority noticeably diminished. He cleared his throat, attempting to regain composure, but his words were halting. "Court appreciates your candor, Dr. Brooks," he said, avoiding her steady gaze. "The fine is rescinded, and the matter of your parking ticket will be reviewed again with due consideration of the evidence you provided." Maya gave a polite nod but said nothing further. She had achieved more than just a resolution to her individual case. The tide of the courtroom had shifted, and the once subdued gallery now brimmed with quiet energy. The older woman in the cardigan, who had started the applause earlier, smiled warmly at Maya. A young black man in the back leaned over to whisper something to the person next to him, his face alight with inspiration. The courtroom clerk looked up from her keyboard, catching Maya's eye with a subtle but unmistakable look of approval. Even the bailiff, a stoic figure who had stood by the judge's bench throughout the confrontation, seemed to hold himself differently, as if he too had felt the weight of the moment. As the session adjourned and people began to shuffle out, Maya gathered her documents, her mind buzzing with the implications of what had just occurred. She had come here expecting to handle a simple matter of fairness over a parking ticket. Instead, she had confronted systemic bias head-on and turned a moment of potential defeat into a call for accountability. Word spread quickly. By the time Maya reached her car, messages were already pouring in. Colleagues from Jefferson Law School were sending texts. "We heard what happened. Are you okay? And you're making us all proud." Social media lit up as someone in the courtroom posted about the exchange. "A law professor just schooled Judge Harris on bias in his own courtroom," one tweet read, quickly gaining traction. The ripple effects of her stand grew in the days that followed. Local news outlets picked up the story, painting a vivid picture of the confrontation. Headlines like "Professor exposes bias in courtroom drama" and "Judge faces scrutiny after incident with law professor" dominated the city's discourse. Discussions about fairness in the judicial system, especially for minorities, began trending in online forums and community meetings. More importantly, Maya's actions didn't just spark conversation, they prompted real change. Within weeks, the state's Judicial Oversight Committee announced an internal review of courtroom practices across the district, citing Maya's case as a catalyst. The review uncovered patterns of disparate treatment in sentencing, fines, and reprimands, especially along racial and socio-economic lines. Maya's phone rang constantly, her email inbox flooded with requests. Advocacy groups invited her to speak about her experience. Legal organizations asked for her insights on systemic bias, and former defendants reached out to thank her. One message stood out: a heartfelt email from a single mother who had faced similar discrimination in court. "You spoke for people like me today," it read. "Thank you for not staying silent." Despite the whirlwind of attention, Maya remained grounded. At Jefferson Law, she returned to her lectures with a renewed sense of purpose. In one class, she recounted the events of that morning to her students, emphasizing the importance of standing up for fairness, even when the odds seem stacked against you. "Justice isn't an abstract concept," she told them. "It's shaped by the decisions we make and the courage we show in moments that matter." Judge Harris, meanwhile, faced mounting pressure. The Judicial Review Board called for mandatory bias training for all judges in the district, a move that drew praise from community leaders and civil rights organizations. Harris himself issued a public statement, acknowledging that the incident had prompted him to reflect on his actions. It wasn't the sweeping admission Maya might have hoped for, but it was a step forward. For Maya, the experience was transformative. She had always known the power of the law to shape lives, but that day had shown her something deeper: the power of individuals to challenge and reform the systems meant to serve them. It reinforced her belief in the importance of action, not just words, in the fight for justice. She framed the receipt from the parking fine she never had to pay, hanging it on the wall of her home office next to her degrees and awards. To her, it wasn't just a reminder of that day, it was a symbol of the work that still needed to be done. Months later, Maya stood at a podium in a packed auditorium, addressing a crowd of law students, community leaders, and activists. "What happened that day in court wasn't just about me," she said, her voice carrying across the room. "It was about every person who has ever been judged unfairly, every person who has felt powerless against a system that's supposed to protect them. Change doesn't come from staying silent. It comes from speaking up, even when it's hard." The applause was deafening, but Maya knew the real work was just beginning. The systemic change she dreamed of wouldn't come overnight, but it was moments like these, moments where truth and courage intersected, that pushed the needle forward. As she left the stage, Maya reflected on the journey ahead. She felt more resolved than ever, not just to teach the principles of justice, but to embody them. Her actions that day in Judge Harris's courtroom had set a precedent, and she was determined to keep building on it. Justice, she believed, wasn't just about laws, it was about people. And as long as there were people willing to stand up, there was hope for change. The courtroom that day became more than a place for resolving legal disputes. It became a stage for change, a reminder of the power of one voice to challenge the status quo. Dr. Maya Brooks could have chosen to quietly accept the judge's fine and move on, but instead she stood her ground. Her courage revealed the biases that often go unchecked in systems meant to protect everyone equally. It wasn't easy, but her actions sparked a movement that continues to inspire and demand accountability. What Maya did wasn't just about confronting one judge or one injustice. It was about exposing a pattern and showing that change begins with individuals willing to speak up. Her stand empowered not only herself but also the many people watching, both in that courtroom and beyond. It was a moment that reminded us all, justice doesn't just happen. It's created through our actions, big and small. What would you do in Maya's position? Have you ever felt unfairly treated or witnessed an injustice in your own life? How did you respond? We want to hear your stories. Share them in the comments below. By opening up these conversations, we can learn from one another and take the steps needed to create a fairer, more just society. Change doesn't happen overnight and the road is often difficult. But as Maya's story shows, it's those moments of courage and truth that can ripple outward, touching lives and reshaping institutions. Let her story be a call to action for all of us. Stand up when it matters, speak up when you see injustice, and remember, even the smallest act of resistance can spark something far greater. Together, we can make justice a reality for everyone.